Howdy, it's Kyle talking about college football and why it's so popular in the Southeast. I think many people, especially non Americans, don't understand why college sports can be so popular in the US, but more specifically, why college football is the single most popular sport in the entire southeastern region of the country. Maybe not specifically cities like Dallas, New Orleans, or Miami, but for the rest of the Southeast, college football is the single most popular sport. When I moved from California to South Carolina in 1999 for graduate school at the University of South Carolina, I knew that college football was way more popular in the Southeast than in the West, but I still wasn't prepared for what I would experience because South Carolina isn't exactly Alabama or Georgia, but every single home game there would be 80,000 people there screaming, and I was there the year they were 0-11. They were the single worst team in all of college football, and not a case of they would have been 4-7 if they were in some other league. No, they would have been 0-11 no matter what they played in. But despite that, there would be 80,000 people there each week. 40,000 yelling game, 40,000 yelling Cox, and who doesn't love 40,000 people yelling Cox at the same time? But despite how bad they were, and it was laughably bad, the stadium was packed every weekend. So how can that possibly be? How can college football be so popular in a place that's really not huge, really not that good, hardly ever? So how can it be so popular there? And that's not even counting places like Texas or Alabama. When people talk about why college football is so much more popular than the NFL in the Southeast, it often goes back to how there just weren't any NFL teams in the South for the longest time, and people just had to root for the college team if they wanted to watch football, and it was more local pride, just something to watch your local state play. So I want to take a look at the history of the NFL, take a look at just where the teams were originally and how they expanded and moved through the years. So the NFL goes back to 1920 when it was called the American Professional Football Association, but it was renamed the National Football League in 1922. So you look at the original league, it's all teams from the Northeast and Midwest, and especially some teams in places you wouldn't expect like Decatur, Hammond, and Muncie. And this would make sense because American football got its start in the Northeast and originally spread to other parts of the Northeast and the Midwest originally, but by 1920 it has definitely spread into the South. And then in the 1940s, you had some big changes as well, some new teams changing their names. And by 1940s, you start to recognize many more of the names in the league. But still, all of these teams are located in the Northeast or the Midwest. And so why are all of these teams located only in this part of the country? Again, football was still popular in the Southeast. And there certainly wasn't difficulty in travel. The distance between New York and Chicago is about the same as New York and Atlanta. But despite the popularity of football in the South, the NFL could not expand to the South because the South was still segregated. By the 1940s, the major sports leagues were desegregated and the leagues were expanding to places outside of the traditional Northeast or Midwest. But they were not able to locate in the Southeast because of segregation. So you can see in 1947, teams in Los Angeles and San Francisco were added. Now it is worth noting that in 1946, they did expand a team in Miami, but it only lasted 1 year. And one of the reasons why the team folded had to do with segregation. There were issues with the stadium and the locker rooms and stuff like that, so the team had to fold. It is worth noting that the NFL did have a team playing in Louisville, Kentucky for a few years well before the end of segregation. Pro baseball also has a history in Louisville as well. However, neither of those two teams played for very long, but Louisville did have teams playing in those pro leagues. My hypothesis is that the history of Kentucky has been much more shaped by the fact it shares a border with Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and West Virginia, and less so with Tennessee. Think about where most of the people in Kentucky live. They live in the Louisville metro area along the Ohio River or along the current I-64 corridor, Frankfort over to Lexington. It's not northern Kentucky, but it's northern part of the state. And then you have the part that's actually called northern Kentucky, the Cincinnati suburbs. Most of the other people are also along the Ohio River, whether across from Evansville, Indiana, or in Paducah, or maybe they're outside of Huntington, West Virginia. But you look at the Kentucky-Tennessee border, there isn't a whole lot going on there. So throughout most of its history, Kentucky has kind of looked north. So with that, perhaps Louisville was a little more lax with its segregation. Maybe they didn't really enforce it that much, but the leagues did try to expand there, though the teams didn't last very long. And then it wasn't until 1960 that the first teams in the South were added to the NFL. That's when the Dallas Cowboys came to existence, but also the Houston Oilers in the AFL. Dallas and Houston were both easing up on segregation, although Texas itself was still segregated. But regardless of any of that, the NFL felt it was okay to expand to Dallas in 1960. 1964 is when the Civil Rights Act was passed, and that was when segregation ended officially in the U.S. So that meant states and cities could no longer officially segregate, and pro sports leagues were free to expand anywhere they wanted. So this was a look at the NFL and AFL teams that existed right at the time the Civil Rights Acts were being passed. And as you can see, except for the Dallas Cowboys and Houston Oilers, nothing in the Southeast. However, 1966, the first year after the Civil Rights Acts, the NFL immediately expands to Miami and Atlanta. And then in 1967, they add New Orleans. But because this was the late 1960s before NFL teams made it to the South, college football had already been very popular for a long time. College football remained segregated in the Southeast up until the 1970s. So take a look at this photo of the 1955 Michigan State University Rose Bowl champions. Two things of note here. One, the team was obviously integrated even though it's 1955. And the other item of note is that Michigan State won a Rose Bowl? What? Now take a look at this photo of the 1969 University of South Carolina roster. 5 years after the end of segregation, every single player is white, and in fact, the first black player for South Carolina was 1972. 1972, and even then, there was only one black player on the entire team. So you have a case where the NFL simply can't be located in the Southeast because of segregation, so you had college football just become the de facto sport to watch in the Southeast, and as the colleges remained segregated throughout the later 50s into the 60s, people still were watching college football because you would still have only white players. And the NFL didn't really gain a huge foothold in the Southeast until the 70s and 80s. And even then, only in the cities that have teams like Dallas, New Orleans, Atlanta, and Miami. But even in Atlanta, but other Southeast NFL cities as well, such as Nashville and Jacksonville, college football is still more popular. So as a scientist, I have to look at maybe the things happening in the late 60s in the NFL were just coincidence. The AFL and NFL were merging at the time, so maybe there was going to be expansion and it was going to be in the Southeast anyway. So I have to look at other things could be going on. It might not have just been civil rights. So just take a look at the NBA to see if there's any kind of correlation there. So you go back to the beginning of the NBA in the 1940s, and it's the same thing as the NFL. All of the original teams are located in the Northeast or the Midwest, and also one in Toronto. And here's a look at the teams in the NBA at the time that the Civil Rights Acts were being passed. So as you can see here, they have expanded to LA and San Francisco, but still nowhere into the South. However, in 1968, the St. Louis Hawks moved to Atlanta, and then in 1971, the San Diego Rockets moved to Houston. Okay, well, what about Major League Baseball? Is it the same thing there? It's the exact same thing. Look at the roster of teams in 1949. They're all from the Northeast or the Midwest. Major League Baseball itself integrated in 1948, and this is the list of the teams in the league in 1949. As you can see here, they're all from the Northeast or the Midwest. And here's a look at the league right before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. By this time, teams are located in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and in 1962, a team was added to Houston. So again, another team from Houston getting into a pro sports league just before the Civil Rights Acts were passed. I'm not sure if segregation was a little more lax. People looked the other way a little more often than Houston, but either way, they got pro sports teams just before segregation ended. But right after segregation ended in 1966, the Milwaukee Braves moved to Atlanta. And in 1972, the Washington Senators moved to Dallas and became the Texas Rangers. So we're seeing the same trends all throughout these leagues, whether it be NFL, NBA, or Major League Baseball. They were all entirely located in the Northeast or the Midwest originally, and then located to the West Coast long before the Southeast, and wouldn't go to the Southeast until after segregation ended. So think specifically about Atlanta. In 1965, they had no pro sports teams, but by 1968 had NBA, NFL, and Major League Baseball. By the time the pro sports teams came to the Southeast, college sports had already been ingrained in the culture and traditions of the Southeast, with just decades of people getting behind the local college team. And so that continues to today with maybe your parents or grandparents were big Alabama or Arkansas fans or whatever, and they pass it on to you. And that just continues to today. So although today it's no longer because of segregation and stuff like that, but that is what started why college football is just so much more popular in the South than the rest of the country. I do want to debunk a couple of things that you often hear talked about as to why college football is more popular in the South. And one is the climate, and it's definitely not the climate. I get the idea of what they're saying in the winter, the off season, you can still practice and train and whatever in the Southeast, not the North. But No, people up north can put up with the cold. If you're from Michigan, you know how to deal with the cold, especially with pads on. You run. I mean, you can train in the off season, so that's not it. For baseball, that is definitely it. You don't have college baseball as popular in the Northwest or the Northeast and the Midwest because it's cold up until April or May. But football, those guys can be out there in pads training off season. Yeah, that's not why. It's definitely not the climate. And it's also not a case of having more community support because the colleges in the South are more likely to be located in smaller towns. That's just not the case. It's the same way up north as well. Think of Champaign, Illinois, or Iowa City, Ames, Iowa, Bloomington, or West Lafayette, Indiana. I mean, State College, Pennsylvania. So there's plenty of towns that are just college towns up there. So that's not why it's more popular in the Southeast. It's because it's located in places like Tuscaloosa or Athens. So those are some of the major points I wanted to talk about as to why college football and college sports in general are just more popular in the Southeast. And I've spent the vast majority of my adult life living in either South Carolina or Tennessee, so I do find it fascinating just how popular college sports are, even in places that have NFL teams. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography from a nerd. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out. I want to give a special thanks to my Superior patrons for their support. If you're interested in becoming a Superior or perhaps an Erie or Huron patron, check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. As always, thank you very much.